The Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The air is so cold it feels like it could shatter like glass. You can't feel your toes. You can barely feel the trigger guard against your finger. You are not a frontline infantryman. You are a radio operator trained to coordinate artillery, not to hold off a wave of the Wehrmacht's elite Panzer Grenadiers. But the lines have broken. The chaos of the Battle of the Bulge has turned cooks, drivers, and clerks into the last line of defense. In the distance, the terrifying roar of a Tiger tank engine echoes through the snow-covered pines. Shapes move in the gray mist, men in heavy gray coats. You look down at your hands. You aren't holding the heavy, reassuring walnut stock of an M1 Garand with its powerful recoil. You are holding something that looks almost like a toy. It weighs barely 5 pounds. It's short. It feels like a stick of firewood compared to a battle rifle. A German soldier breaks through the tree line, barely 50 yards away. He raises his Mauser. You have a split second. You raise the small carbine, the peep sight finding the gray mass of the enemy. You pull the trigger. There is no massive boom, just a sharp crack. The enemy flinches but keeps coming. You fire again and again. The panic rises in your throat. Is this little weapon enough to save your life when the world is burning around you? Or is this the moment your war ends in the snow? But to understand why you are standing there freezing, holding a weapon made by a jukebox company, we have to go back. We have to understand a story that involves a moonshiner, a prison cell, a logistical miracle, and the desperate need to arm a nation that was waking up to a nightmare. How did a convicted murderer and a typewriter manufacturer conspire to create the most produced American firearm of the Second World War? The world of 1940 was a place where old rules were dying fast. The United States Army was watching the newsreels coming out of Europe with a growing sense of dread. They saw the German blitzkrieg. They saw lightning-fast armored columns punching through lines, bypassing fortifications, and wreaking havoc in the rear areas. In the old war, the Great War, there was a front line and a rear line. The guys in the back, the truck drivers driving supplies, the mortar crews, the radio men, the officers, were relatively safe. But the Germans had changed the game. Now, everyone was a target, and the U.S. Army realized it had a massive, fatal problem. The standard issue weapon for these support troops was the M1911 pistol. It was a beautiful, powerful handgun, but let's be honest, in the hands of a terrified truck driver who fires it once a year for qualification, hitting a moving target at 50 yards was nearly impossible. The alternative was the M1 Garand. The Garand was a masterpiece, but it was nearly 10 pounds of steel and wood. It was long, cumbersome, and got in the way if you were trying to drive a Jeep, crawl through a foxhole with a radio on your back, or operate a mortar. So, you had hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were effectively defenseless beyond 20 yards. The Army calculated the cost. If a supply convoy was ambushed, the drivers would be slaughtered before they could even return fire. They needed a bridge. They needed something lighter than a rifle, but with more range and accuracy than a pistol. They needed a light rifle. But where do you find a weapon that doesn't exist, especially when the clouds of war are already gathering over the Pacific and the Atlantic? And more importantly, who would be crazy enough to try to invent one in a matter of weeks? The answer to that question didn't come from a pristine laboratory or a prestigious military academy. It came from the humid, desperate atmosphere of a North Carolina prison camp. Enter David Marshall Williams. To his neighbors, he was a troublemaker. To the law, he was a moonshiner. In 1921, a distillery raid went wrong. Deputy Al Pate was shot dead. Williams was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in the Caledonia State Prison farm. This should have been the end of his life, a man in a cage, rotting away. But Williams had a mind that couldn't sit still. He was obsessed with machines, with mechanics, with the way metal moved against metal. In the solitary confinement of his mind, and eventually in the prison machine shop where he was allowed to work, he began to dream. He didn't have blueprints. He drew on scrap paper. He used old car axles and scrap iron. He was looking for a way to harness the violent energy of a gunshot to cycle a weapon without the massive, heavy operating rods used in other guns. He invented the short-stroke gas piston. It was a tiny, floating piece of metal that took a punch of gas from the barrel and tapped the bolt open. It was violent, it was simple, and it was brilliant. When he was released early in 1929, his reputation as a genius tinkerer had spread. But the road from a prison cell to the War Department was not a straight line. By 1940, Winchester Repeating Arms Company had hired him. But Williams was difficult. He was proud, stubborn, and carried the hardness of his prison years. He clashed with the formally trained engineers. The Army issued the challenge: build a light rifle that weighs 5 pounds and is effective out to 300 yards. Winchester wasn't even going to enter the competition. They were swamped building the Garand. But when the initial tests of other companies' prototypes failed miserably, a small team at Winchester looked at Williams's gas piston concept. They had 13 days, not months. Days. Can you imagine the pressure? A team of engineers working around the clock, fueled by coffee and adrenaline, trying to cobble together a weapon that would determine the fate of millions. They took the barrel of an existing sporting rifle, the trigger group from a shotgun concept, and Williams' floating piston. They filed metal by hand. They slept on the workshop floor. When the prototype arrived at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, it looked rough. But when they pulled the trigger, it worked. It didn't jam. It didn't break. It was light as a feather compared to the Garand. The soldiers testing it fell in love immediately. It was officially adopted as the United States Carbine Caliber 30 M1. This happened just weeks before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The timing was miraculous, but inventing the gun was the easy part. Now they had to build millions of them for a war that had just exploded across the entire globe. But how do you arm an entire generation when your gun factories are already at maximum capacity? This brings us to the most surreal aspect of the M1 carbine story. If you were a soldier in 1943 and you looked at the stamp on the barrel of your weapon, you might see a name that made no sense. You might see IBM. Yes, the company that made punch card tabulators and would later invent the personal computer. You might see Rockola, a company famous for making jukeboxes for dance halls and bars. You might see Underwood, a company that made the typewriter sitting on a clerk's desk. You might see General Motors. This was the genius of American industrial might. The government took the blueprints of the M1 carbine and mailed them to companies that had never built a gun in their existence. They told the jukebox makers, stop making music machines. Start making stocks and barrels. They told the typewriter mechanics, you know how to make precise, small metal parts? Good, make triggers. It was a logistical nightmare. Parts made in a typewriter factory in Connecticut had to fit perfectly into a receiver made by a jukebox factory in Chicago. And they did. The M1 carbine was the first truly modular weapon of the war. Production exploded. The cost dropped from $45 to $31 per unit. While the Nazis were hand-fitting beautiful rifles with old-world craftsmanship that took days to finish, American factories were spitting out M1 carbines like they were Coca-Cola bottles. By the end of the war, over 6 million had been made. It remains the most produced American small arm in military history, surpassing the M1 Garand by nearly 2 million units. Everywhere you looked, there was the carbine. It was in the hands of paratroopers dropping into Normandy, who needed something that wouldn't break their legs when they hit the ground. It was in the hands of Marines storming the beaches of Saipan. It was strapped to the chests of tank commanders in North Africa. It changed the doctrine of war. Suddenly, the tail of the army had teeth. A mortar crew could now defend itself against an infantry rush. A truck convoy could put up a wall of fire. The morale boost was immeasurable. You weren't helpless anymore. You had 15 rounds of semi-automatic fury at your fingertips. But as the war dragged on, a dark whisper began to circulate among the troops. A whisper that would haunt the reputation of this weapon for decades. Is a weapon truly effective if the enemy refuses to fall? The contrast between the theory of the M1 carbine and the reality of combat began to show itself in the bloody jungles of the Pacific. The cartridge, the .30 carbine, was essentially a pistol round with a little more powder behind it. It was fast, but it was light. In Europe, against German soldiers wearing wool coats, it performed adequately. But in the Pacific, Marines reported terrifying encounters. Japanese soldiers, sometimes fueled by adrenaline, sheer will, or desperation, would charge out of the undergrowth. A Marine would put 2-3 rounds into the attacker's chest. The attacker would keep coming. There were stories of Japanese soldiers taking a hit, pausing, and continuing the charge to bayonet the Marine who shot them. The stopping power controversy was born. The soldiers loved the weight of the gun. You could carry it all day and not get tired. But they stopped trusting its lethality. The manual said the effective range was 300 yards. The soldiers knew better. At 300 yards, the bullet was moving so slowly it might struggle to penetrate heavy clothing. The disparity between what the generals in Washington thought the gun could do and what the private in the mud knew it could do was costing lives. Imagine the horror of shooting a man, seeing the dust fly off his uniform where the bullet hit, and watching him raise his rifle to kill you. It forces a change in tactics. You don't shoot once. You shoot until the magazine is empty. You aim for the head. You adapt. Yet amidst these complaints, there were moments where the M1 carbine proved that it wasn't just a toy. It was a weapon of war that could change the tide of battle if placed in the hands of a warrior who knew no fear. There is no greater example of this than the story of a young, undersized kid from Texas named Audie Murphy. January 1945. The Colmar Pocket, France. The ground is frozen solid. Lieutenant Audie Murphy's company is decimated. They are under attack by 6 German tanks and waves of infantry. Murphy orders his men to retreat into the woods. He stays behind. He climbs onto a burning tank destroyer. The vehicle is a death trap, filled with fuel and ammunition, likely to explode at any second. He mans the .50 caliber machine gun on top, but he also has his personal weapon, an M1 carbine. For an hour, Murphy holds off an entire German company. When the machine gun jams or he needs to engage closer targets, he uses the carbine. He is wounded in the leg. The tank destroyer is engulfed in flames, yet he continues to fire. The Germans are confused. They think they are facing a whole platoon. They can't imagine one man, 5 feet 5 inches tall, is stopping their advance. Murphy used the M1 carbine exactly as it was intended, a rapid-fire maneuverable weapon that allowed him to suppress the enemy and protect his flank. He killed or wounded dozens of German soldiers that day. He didn't complain about stopping power. He placed his shots. He used the volume of fire. He survived, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor. This moment is the point of no return for the weapon's legacy. It proved that while the bullet might have been small, the system worked. It allowed a single man to exert a tremendous amount of force. It validated the concept of a personal defense weapon decades before the term was invented. But if the carbine was a hero in World War II, why did its reputation suffer so badly just 5 years later in the frozen hills of Korea? By the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, the M1 carbine had evolved. It was now the M2. It had a switch. It could fire fully automatic. It had a 30-round magazine. On paper, it was an assault rifle before the AK-47 became famous. But Korea was different. The cold was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. The Chinese soldiers wore thick, quilted cotton uniforms, layer upon layer. Stories began to flood back from the Chosin Reservoir. GIs reported shooting Chinese soldiers at close range, only to see the bullets bounce off the frozen, thick clothing. Was it true? Or were the bullets missing? Or were they passing through the layers without hitting vital organs? The psychological impact was devastating. Confidence in the weapon plummeted. The fully automatic feature of the M2 actually made things worse for inexperienced troops. They would panic, pull the trigger, and dump 30 rounds into the sky in 2 seconds, leaving them with an empty gun and a charging enemy. The solution wasn't in the mechanics, it was in the discipline. Veterans learned to tap the trigger, to aim low, to treat it like a scalpel, not a fire hose. But the damage to its reputation was done. The US military began looking for something else, a search that would eventually lead to the M14 and then the M16. However, the genie was out of the bottle. The M1 carbine had disseminated across the world. It was small, easy to use, and there were millions of them. From the jungles of Vietnam in the hands of advisors and local troops to the police forces of South America, the jukebox gun refused to retire. So, what is the final verdict on this little weapon? Depending on who you ask, the M1 carbine is either the greatest firearm ever made for support troops or a dangerous, underpowered failure. Ask the paratrooper who landed in Normandy with 80 pounds of gear. He will tell you he loved it because it didn't weigh him down. He will tell you that it was fast and handy in the hedgerows. Ask the Marine on Iwo Jima. He might tell you he wished he had a Garand when the enemy was charging, but he was glad he had the carbine when he had to clear a tight cave. The legacy of the M1 carbine isn't just about ballistics, it's about the democratization of firepower. It was the weapon that acknowledged that in modern war, everyone fights. The driver, the cook, the radio operator. It gave them a fighting chance. It proved that American industry could turn on a dime, that a company making typewriters could help defeat tyranny, and it left us with a design lineage. The rotating bolt and gas piston system influenced the M16, the AK-47, and almost every modern military rifle used today. David Marshall Williams, the ex-convict, didn't just build a gun, he built the DNA of modern infantry weapons. Today, if you hold an M1 carbine, you are struck by how light it is. It feels friendly. It lacks the menacing weight of a battle rifle. But make no mistake, this wood and steel creation, born in a prison mind and built by jukebox hands, liberated Europe and defended the Pacific. It reminds us that sometimes the solution to a massive problem doesn't look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a small, unassuming tool that just happens to work when you need it most. As we look back at the faces of the men in the faded black and white photos, the guys sitting on ammunition crates, the ones leaning out of Jeep windows, notice what they are holding. It's usually a carbine. They were the backbone of the war effort, and this was their sword. What do you think? Would you trust your life to the M1 carbine in the frozen woods of Bastogne? Or would you take the weight penalty of the heavy M1 Garand? If this story of the jukebox gun surprised you, or if you had ancestors who carried one, tell us their story in the comments below. History is made of these small details, and we want to hear yours. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories where we dig up the hidden truths of warfare. Until the next mission.